The Arizona sun did not ease you into it. It arrived all at once. Full weight, full heat, the kind that pressed down on the top of your skull like a hand that meant to keep you in the ground. It was not a heat that asked permission or offered warning. It simply arrived the way authority arrived, expecting to be accommodated. Edenvale stepped off the stage at Harrow with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a leather document envelope tucked against her ribs under her arm. The envelope was not new. The stitching at the corners had been repaired twice. The leather had gone dark and soft from years of being handled by a man who kept it close when everything else was uncertain. Her father had handled it that way. She handled it the same. Harrow sat in a basin between two red rock ridges, which gave it the look of a place that had been poured in and left to dry. The buildings along the main street were solid enough by frontier standards. A general store with barrels of dried goods stacked outside, under a canvas awning that had faded from whatever color it had started as to a uniform pale cream. A land office narrow with a hand-lettered sign above the door that had been repainted once and not recently. A hotel with a fresh coat of paint that had already started to blister in the heat, the white surface puckering and separating from the wood, the way skin separated from a burn. A barber shop. A church at the far end of the main street set back slightly from the road as if maintaining a careful distance from everything else. And a saloon at the near end large with a covered porch that ran the full width of the building. 3 men sat on that porch. They had chairs. They had the particular stillness of men who were waiting for something and had been waiting long enough to have learned patience about it. They were not watching the stage arrive. They were not watching the street. They were not watching anything in particular, but they were not watching either. Eden noticed this. She had learned to notice it from a father who had spent 20 years reading rock formations in places where one wrong read meant the shaft collapsed on you. You looked at what a thing was doing, not what it was supposed to be doing. You watched the tension in the timber, not the timber itself. You watched the air above the shafts for changes in the dust pattern. You watched the way water moved in an ore vein and understood from the movement where the vein was heading before you ever cut into it. These 3 men were doing the specific thing that men did when they were watching something and had decided for one reason or another not to be seen watching it. The stage driver tossed her bag down without ceremony and clicked his team forward before she had fully stepped clear of the wheel. The dust his departure raised settled slowly in the still air. She let it settle, looked down the length of the street. Harrow had a quality about it that she had noticed in certain mining towns before, a quality of enforced prosperity. Everything too neat, too consistent, too much the same. As if someone had gone along the street one day and decided exactly how things were going to look, and the decision had been carried out with a thoroughness that left no room for the ordinary organic untidiness of a place that had grown by accident. This was not a town that had grown by accident. The land office was the third door on the left. She went there first. The man behind the counter was in his 50s, gray-haired, with the look of someone who had been occupying the same physical space for so long that the space had shaped itself around him. The particular compression in his shoulders, the way his elbows found the counter edge with the ease of long habit, the angle of his head when he looked up. He had been here a long time. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her. He looked at the document envelope tucked under her arm. And then, briefly, so briefly she might have missed it if she had been looking at his face instead of the direction of his attention, he looked at the wall behind her, at the window, as if checking for something outside. "I'm here to complete a transfer registration," Eden said. She set the envelope on the counter and opened it with practiced efficiency, laying each document out in order as she spoke. My father filed the original claim on the Vale plot. Parcel 47, Section 9, up against the east ridge of Devil's Jaw Canyon. He died before completing registration. I have the original claim papers, the assay documentation from '68, and a notarized letter from the county recorder in Flagstaff confirming the claim is still active and in good standing. The man looked at the documents. His hands did not move toward them. A man whose job was processing land transfers looked at documents the way a carpenter looked at wood, automatically, reaching for them before the thought was finished. It was instinct built from repetition. His hands did not move because he had already decided not to process them, which meant the decision had been made before she walked in. "These are all in order," Eden said. "I can see that," he said. "Then I'll need the transfer registration form." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved again to the window briefly and returned to her face. "I'll need to verify with the county assessor's office before I can process a transfer on that particular parcel. The notarized letter from Flagstaff is the county verification. We have our own process here in Harrow. How long does your process take?" Another pause. The pause of a man calculating. "Could be a few days." Eden looked at him steadily. She was not angry. She was not frightened. She was gathering information the way her father had gathered information from rock formations, noting everything without reacting to any of it, waiting until the full picture was available before drawing a conclusion. She gathered her documents, placed them back in the envelope in the same careful order she had taken them out. She looked at the man directly. "I'll be at the hotel," she said. He nodded, still not quite meeting her eyes. She went out into the heat. The hotel room was small but clean. A window that looked out over the main street and caught the afternoon light in a way that turned everything the color of old brass. A bed with a rope spring mattress that was harder than she would have liked but adequate. A washstand, a chair. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope again. Not because she doubted them. She knew exactly what they said. She had read them so many times in the 7 months since she had decided to come here that she could have recited them from memory in the dark. She read them again now because she wanted to be certain that nothing she had done in the land office, nothing in the way she had presented herself or her documents had created a legitimate reason for delay. There was none. The claim was clean. The notarization was current. The assay documentation was complete. The letter from Flagstaff was explicit. There was nothing in the paperwork that justified a single day of delay, let alone a few. Her father had filed the claim 3 years ago. He had been prospecting in the high country east of Harrow for most of a decade, moving from site to site, the way water moved through rock, following what the geology told him, reading the formations, with an expertise built from 2 decades of hard experience. He had never found enough to make him rich. He had found enough to keep going. And then 2 years ago, his letters had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed a casual reader, but she had been reading his letters since she was old enough to read, and she knew the rhythm of them, the specific way his thoughts moved across paper, the patterns of his enthusiasm and his caution. Something in the rhythm had shifted. He had written, "There is something interesting here, more than I expected when I came out this way. I am not prepared to say more until I understand it better." He had written 3 months later, "The land itself has real value regardless of what sits below it. The water situation up on the East Ridge is unlike anything I've found in this country. Permanent source, reliable year-round. That alone is worth holding. And then in the last letter, I am sending you the claim papers for safekeeping. Keep them close to you. Don't discuss them with anyone. I'll explain more when I can come in person." After that, the letters had stopped. 3 months of silence. And then the notification from the sheriff's office in Harrow. Her father had died of a fever. He had been found by a passing rider in the canyon country east of town. His camp had been struck before the body was discovered. No other details were available. No fever left a man with a struck camp. Eden had not said this to anyone. She had not written it down. She had held it in her mind for 7 months, turning it over the way you turned a piece of ore in your hand to read it, pressing it from different angles to see what it revealed while she worked, and saved and waited until she had enough for the stage fare and 2 weeks at whatever Harrow was charging. She set the papers down, lay back on the bed, watched the brass light move across the ceiling, and thought about what the land office man's hands had done when she laid the documents out in front of him. They had not moved. She went over it again and confirmed it. The documents were his job. His instinct should have been to reach for them. He had seen them and done nothing, which meant he had already been told to do nothing, which meant someone had known she was coming, which meant her arrival had been reported or anticipated or both. The saloon music started up somewhere below her window, thin and slightly out of tune, somebody working a piano with more enthusiasm than precision. She listened to it for a while and went over everything she knew. She did not sleep much that night. She was in the saloon the next morning for breakfast, seated at a corner table with coffee and cornbread, when Stafford Nance walked in. She knew it was him before anyone said his name. He had the walk of a man who had never once in his adult life entered a room and wondered whether he was welcome in it. Not arrogance exactly. Something more complete than arrogance. A settled certainty about the geography of his own position in the world that went all the way down to the bone. He was perhaps 60 broad through the chest, with white hair cut close, and a face that was handsome in the way of men who had been told so for long enough that they had stopped thinking about it. His coat was dark and well cut, the kind of cut that came from a tailor in a city, not a dry goods store. His boots were expensive. He smiled easily and constantly. The way a man smiled when smiling cost him nothing, because he had never needed anything from the person he was smiling at. He came directly to her table. She watched him cross the room, watched the way the other men in the saloon tracked his movement without appearing to. Watched the subtle adjustments in posture, the small, unconscious performances of men in the presence of someone they were accustomed to deferring to. He pulled out the chair across from her without being invited and sat down in it with the ease of a man sitting in his own home. "Miss Vale," he said, "I heard you came in on yesterday's stage. I apologize for not greeting you sooner." She looked at him across the table. She did not smile. She was not hostile. She was simply looking at him, taking an accurate account. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said. "Stafford Nance." He said it the way people said the name of a town, as if the name and the geography were the same thing, and knowing one meant knowing the other. "I own most of the valley land south of the ridge line, and I have interests in a fair portion of the town as well. When someone arrives in Harrow with business involving the land, it usually finds its way to my attention. My business is with the county land office." "Of course." He smiled wider. "I happened to mention to Arthur down there that he might want to take some time with your paperwork. There are complications with that particular parcel you're looking at. Disputed survey lines. The kind of thing that can tie up a transfer for months if you're not careful." "I'm familiar with disputed survey lines," she said. "I've seen the government survey for that section. There are no disputed lines on parcel 47. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and controlled, not visible to someone who wasn't watching for it. "Survey records don't always tell the complete story," he said pleasantly. "There are prior claims to consider, informal arrangements that predate the formal record. I've had some experience with that section of the ridge. He leaned back in his chair with the comfort of a man who had never been required to be uncomfortable. I'd hate to see you spend your time and money on a claim that was going to be contested at every step. Is someone contesting it? Not yet. A beat. That's the thing about contested claims. They come up after the fact. Once money has been spent and expectations have been set. It's a hard way to learn a lesson. Eden looked at him for a moment. He was telling her to leave. He was doing it in the nicest possible way, the way a man told you something when he wanted to be able to say later that he had warned you. The smile and the pleasant voice and the reasonable tone were all load-bearing elements of a message that was not reasonable at all. She said, I appreciate the concern. I'll be discussing the paperwork directly with Arthur. Something passed through Nance's expression. A calculation quick and final filed away in under a second. Of course, he said. He stood, buttoned his coat. The smile remained at full brightness. My offer to purchase the parcel outright still stands if you find the process too involved. Fair market value. Better than anything you'd net from working the land yourself. Come find me if you change your mind. He walked out. The saloon had been quieter while he was at her table. It got louder once he was gone. Not all at once. Gradually. Like people who had been holding their breath without being aware of it, releasing in increments, the noise returning in layers, the way sound returned to a room after a door closed. Eden drank her coffee. She looked at nothing in particular and listened to the way the noise came back. She went back to her room. On the floor, just inside the door, folded once, was a small piece of paper. She looked at it for a moment before picking it up, looked at the door which she had locked, and at the gap at the bottom of it, which was wide enough. She picked it up. The handwriting was careful, deliberate in the way that deliberate handwriting was different from practiced handwriting. This was not a man who wrote often. He had thought about each word before he committed it. Do not go out to the land with Nance's men. If you must go, go alone. No signature. She read it twice. Then she looked out the window at the street below. A boy leading a mule. A woman arranging something in the window of the general store. The ordinary activity of a small town going about its morning. And on the porch of the hardware store across the street, not looking at her window, not looking at anything in particular, standing with the relaxed, unhurried stillness of a man who had learned how to be present without being visible. A man she had noticed the previous evening in the saloon. He had been near the bar position so that he could see the whole room without appearing to watch any of it. She had noticed him because of this exact quality, his ability to be unnoticed. It was a specific skill, and not everyone had it. He did, but he was not unnoticed by her. He turned and walked away from the hardware store at an unhurried pace, heading south along the street, not looking back. She watched him go. She folded the note and put it in the envelope with her father's papers, and spent the rest of the morning thinking about it carefully. She learned his name by the simple expedient of asking the hotel clerk who the quiet man was, the one with the dark coat who usually stood near the bar at the saloon. The clerk told her without hesitation. Rudd Deeds. He worked for Nance, had for years, handled various tasks. The clerk was vague about what tasks exactly, which in Eden's experience meant the tasks were understood but not discussed. Rudd Deeds, one of Nance's men, sending her a note warning her away from Nance's other men. The logic of this was worth examining carefully. The next day, two men from Nance's operation came to the hotel and offered to guide her out to the parcel. They were polite about it, professional. One of them had a broad, pleasant face and moved with the ease of a man accustomed to outdoor work. The other was quieter, kept his thumbs hooked in his belt, and looked at the middle distance when he spoke, which was a habit Eden associated with men who were monitoring their surroundings without wanting to appear to be doing so. She knew what this was. She also knew that if she refused, she had no legitimate way to reach the land without being followed and turned back before she got there. She had spent 2 full days studying maps and asking careful questions of the hotel clerk and an obliging old man who drank his morning coffee on the steps of the general store and seemed to have been doing so since before Harrow had a general store. She understood the terrain. She knew the canyon approaches in general terms. She also knew she could not get there and back without a guide who knew the specific paths, and that finding such a guide independently in a town where Nance's reach extended to the land office would not be easy. So she did the thing that made the most sense to her, which was to go. But before she left, she went to the hotel desk and prepaid another 10 days. She told the clerk she expected to be back by supper, but that if she was not, her room should be held regardless. She said this at a normal volume, which was loud enough to be heard by the 2 other guests standing in the lobby. She told the old man on the general store steps that she was going out east to look at her father's land, and that she'd be back by evening. He looked at her with eyes that had seen a great deal and said he hoped that would be so. Then she tucked the document envelope deep inside her traveling coat, under the lining against her ribs, and secured it with the pins she had prepared the previous day. She went with them. The ride east took them along the base of the Red Rock Ridge. The country here was broken and dry, with a completeness of country that had been dry for a long time and expected to remain so. Scrub brush, barrel cactus, loose shale that shifted under the horses' feet and made small tearing sounds. The ridge on their left rose sheer and red-brown, the face of it catching the morning sun, and giving it back multiplied the heat radiating from the rock surface in visible waves. The broader man talked. He was friendly in the way of men who had learned to be friendly as a professional skill rather than a personal quality. He pointed out landmarks, made observations about the terrain, kept a steady, easy patter going that served the function of filling the space between them with something that felt like normal human communication without actually being it. The quieter man rode behind her, always behind. She was aware of his position at every moment without turning to look at it. She noted it the way she noted the position of load-bearing walls in an unfamiliar structure, as information that might matter later. Devil's Jaw appeared gradually, first as a darkening of the rock face to the east, then as a shadow that resolved into a cleft, then as an opening in the ridge that deepened as they approached, until it became something with genuine presence. The canyon walls were sheer and red-brown, rising hundreds of feet above the narrow floor. The light at the bottom was different from the light of the open desert, cooler, more shadow than direct sun. The sound changed too when they rode in close to the canyon mouth. The desert had a quality of space to its silence, sound absorbed and dispersed over flat open distance. The canyon had a different quality, a contained resonant sound bouncing between surfaces that were too far apart for a proper echo, but close enough to alter the texture of the air. She had been watching the broader man's right hand for the last quarter-mile. She was still watching it when he pulled his horse up at a flat outcrop near the canyon's mouth and said there was a good view of the parcel from there. She dismounted. She kept her eyes on the flat outcrop and on the drop below it, and on the angle of the quieter man's horse behind her as she moved to the edge to look at the view. The hand hit her between the shoulder blades. It was simple and efficient, a firm shove with the full weight of a large man behind it, timed to catch her with her weight already forward and her attention on the view below. Her foot caught the edge of the outcrop and her balance went wrong all at once, the way balance went wrong when it was gone before you could reach for it. Then falling. The scraping of rock against her side, her shoulder, her hip. The world turning sideways and then vertical, and then nothing but the impact and the white noise it made when it hit. She came to rest against a sandstone slab at the floor of the canyon. She lay still. Her lungs had nothing in them. The impact had taken everything. The first breath was nothing. The second was a sliver. The third finally opened her chest, but the opening hurt. Her ribs on the right side. The pain was specific and bright and persistent. She looked up. Two silhouettes against the narrow strip of sky at the canyon's rim 40 feet above. The broader man was looking down. He held something. Her traveling coat had come partially open in the fall, and she pressed her hand to her ribs and found the document envelope still in place, still secured by the pins she had put in it. The thing in his hand was not the envelope. It was her notebook. She had been using it to record the route and the terrain. He looked at it, turned it over, dropped it, turned away. The quieter man was already gone. Their footsteps faded, and then there was nothing. Nothing except the absolute silence of the canyon floor, the kind of silence that had weight and pressure to it, that pressed against the ears the way deep water pressed against a diver. The silence of a place that had decided a long time ago that it was not interested in human activity and had nothing to say about it. Eden did not move for a long time. She counted her injuries the way her father had taught her to count resources when things went wrong. You did not panic, you took stock. You established what you had and what you had lost, and what the situation actually was before you decided what to do about it. Right ribs damaged, possibly cracked, definitely not broken through, or she would not be breathing at this depth. She would know if they were broken through because breathing would be actively impossible rather than merely painful. Left palm scraped raw against the rock face during the fall, bleeding but not badly. Left knee impact bruise, painful but functional. The joint moved correctly. Head no ringing, no visual disturbance, no gap in her awareness of what had happened. Present in accounting. She sat up slowly. The ribs registered the change in position with a sharp, specific objection that she breathed through deliberately. The canyon walls around her were sheer. She had known they would be before she arrived. She had read about Devil's Jaw in a county geographic survey that the hotel clerk's friend had let her borrow for an hour 3 days ago. No natural handholds above the first 20 feet of wall face. No ramp exits accessible within a mile of the main canyon entrance. The floor at the bottom received direct sunlight in the afternoon and retained the temperature at the canyon floor, reaching levels that made extended exposure genuinely dangerous in summer. She looked at the walls. Then she looked at the floor. The floor of Devil's Jaw was cracked in the pattern that hard-packed desert soil cracked in everywhere in this country. Uniform breaks in a roughly hexagonal pattern, each crack the result of water that had been there and left. The color was the pale gray-brown of very old, very dry ground. Except 20 feet from where she sat, running in a thin line toward the western end of the canyon, where a massive rockfall had closed off the passage a long time ago, the soil was darker. Not much darker. A shade. The width of a man's finger. But in a canyon where the ground was uniformly pale and uniformly dry, a line of darker soil was not nothing. She got up, the ribs objected. She breathed through the objection and moved to the line of darker soil and crouched. Damp, not wet, not a visible seep, just the faint, almost theoretical dampness of soil that had moisture somewhere below the surface, the kind that survived in deep rock formations. Even when the surface had been dry for a decade, the moisture held in the stone itself and breathing upward in a quantity too small to see, but large enough to measure in the color of the soil. She followed it west. The line was not straight. It curved twice, tracing something under the surface that had its own logic. A channel, a fissure in the subsurface rock that was directing the movement of water too far down to see. The rockfall at the western end of the canyon was old, not recent. The boulders had taken on the full color of the surrounding walls, the decades of weathering having erased whatever difference in shade they might originally have shown. The vegetation that had established itself in the cracks between them was mature and settled. Decades of growth. This had happened a long time ago, and the canyon had absorbed it as simply another feature of itself. The dark soil line disappeared under the base of the rockfall. Eden stopped. She looked at the rockfall, at the way the boulders lay against each other, the angles of their surfaces, the spaces between them. Most of the spaces were clogged with debris, wind-driven sand, and rock dust accumulated over years. But one space low and to the left under a flat overhang slab was different. She crouched lower. The clear space was roughly the width of her shoulders. The rock on either side of the opening was smooth in a way that fractured rock was not smooth. The kind of smoothness that came from repeated contact, from something passing through repeatedly over a long period. She put her hand into the space. The air on the other side was cooler by several degrees, and it was moving, slowly, barely detectably, but moving. Air that was moving had to be going somewhere and coming from somewhere, which meant the space opened into something larger than itself. She cleared the loose rock from around the opening. The pain in her ribs was present but manageable when she breathed carefully. Her palms were bleeding where the rock had scraped them in the fall, and she wiped them on her trousers without stopping work. When the opening was as large as she could make it, she lay flat and pushed herself through. The rock pressed against her back and against her chest, and then released all at once, and she was through, and she got to her feet on the other side. She stopped moving. She had been expecting a cave, a low-space rock walls pressing close the tight, damp dark of a natural cavity, small enough to hold a few men for a few nights. The kind of place that showed up in outlaw stories. What she was standing in front of was not that. She was standing in front of a door. Not a door in the way that wood and iron made a door in the way that architecture made a door. Two columns of worked sandstone rose on either side of an opening, each column carved from the natural rock of the canyon wall, but shaped by human hands into something deliberate and precise. The columns were perhaps 8 feet tall. The arch that connected them at the top was not the rough arc of a natural opening, but a true arch, a properly proportioned masonry arch, with a keystone carved out of the living canyon rock, with tools and patience and skill. At the top of the arch, in shallow relief, a figure had been carved. An eagle, wings spread, head turned to the left. The detail was not decorative. It was exact. Each feather of the extended wings was individually represented. The eye was a deep round hollow that caught the faint light from the passage behind her and held it. Eden looked at the carving for a long time. She looked at the columns, at the masonry of the arch, at the way the carved surfaces met the natural rock around them, flowing continuously from one to the other, as if whoever had made this had understood from the beginning that the door and the wall it was cut into were the same material and should be treated as such. This was not recent work. The patina on the carved surfaces was decades deep, but it was not ancient either, not centuries. This was the work of people who had lived within the last 50 years, who had modern tools and technical knowledge of stoneworking, who had spent considerable time, perhaps years, making something that was meant to last, and who had made it inside a canyon that the entire territory of Arizona believed to be empty and fatal. She walked through the arch. The passage beyond sloped gently downward into the dark. On the floor of the passage, two parallel lines of iron rail ran the full length. The wooden ties between them set into the stone itself, the spikes driven into holes drilled in the rock. A mine rail system, completely installed. The rails were rusted but structurally intact. She bent to check the gauge. Standard ore cart gauge, the same she had seen in a dozen operations over the years. She followed the rails. After perhaps 50 feet, the passage opened. She stopped at the edge of the opening and let her eyes adjust to the greater dark. She was in a chamber, not a natural chamber. The ceiling was vaulted, the curve of it too, even and too intentional to be anything other than deliberately shaped from the natural rock. The walls were worked stone-flat surfaces where the natural rock had been cut back and squared with tools. The floor was level, true level accomplished through either natural fortune or considerable effort. The chamber was 40 feet long and perhaps 20 feet wide, though her estimates were uncertain in the dark. Along the right wall, 7 openings led to smaller rooms. Each opening was squared off, and the rock above each had been dressed smooth. The rooms were not sealed. She could see into them from the chamber entrance. Equipment in some of them. Stacked wooden crates in others. In the largest, a collection of iron-banded chests arranged along the back wall with a deliberateness that suggested they had been placed, not stored. On the left wall, taking up the entire surface from floor to ceiling, was a map, not scratched into the rock, not drawn on it, carved relief work. The entire territory of Arizona rendered in stone at a scale she estimated at roughly 2 feet for every 10 miles of territory. The mountain ranges were raised above the surface. The river courses were channels cut into the stone. The towns were marked with their names cut in clean block letters, the lettering precise enough to suggest a man with either professional skill or extensive practice. She walked to the map. She found Harrow, found Devil's Jaw Canyon marked with a small symbol she could not read clearly in the available light. Found the route she had taken from Flagstaff, each waypoint marked. Found Prescott. Found every major geographic feature of the territory she had crossed to reach this place. And found other marks whose meaning she could not immediately determine. Lines connecting multiple points running between towns and between unmarked locations in the open country. Numbers beside many of the marks. A system of notation that had its own internal logic and would require time and context to decode fully. She turned back to the main chamber. At the far end, a door. Iron. Set into a frame cut directly into the rock. A heavy iron lock, the kind made to last, on the outside of the door. No handle on the near side. The surface of the door was unmarked. Through the gap at the bottom of the door, barely visible, almost theoretical, a faint smell reached her. She knew that smell. She had grown up in mining camps, and she had grown up with the reality of what enclosed spaces and time and the absence of air circulation did to organic matter. She knew this smell without having to name it or place it. She stepped back from the door. She did not touch it. She turned and looked at the chamber again with the question of the locked door behind her and the full scale of what she was standing in suddenly arriving in her chest all at once. Someone had built this, had built it over years, possibly many years, had moved equipment and supplies and rail iron into a canyon that the entire territory believed to be empty and impassable, had carved an arch over the entrance with an eagle in relief above it, and had built 7 side rooms and a vaulted main chamber, and had installed a rail system, and had carved a complete cartographic survey of the Arizona territory into the left wall, and at some point had locked the last room from the outside and left, or been made to leave. The sound reached her before anything else. The particular sound of boots on the stone floor of the passage, one person moving carefully, not hurrying, but not stopping. Eden moved to the shadow of the arch between two of the side room openings and waited. A figure came through the main entrance arch. A large man, she could tell that from the way he moved through the passage, his shoulders clearing the walls by only a few inches. He was carrying a canteen in one hand and a rifle in the other, the rifle loose in his grip, the way experienced men carried rifles when they were alert but not yet alarmed. He stopped at the edge of the main chamber and looked around at the work stone walls, the vaulted ceiling, the iron rail on the floor, the map on the left wall. He was not one of Nance's two men. She had studied Nance's men for 2 days, and she was confident of this. He looked at the iron door at the far end of the chamber, then at the map, then at the side rooms, then at the arch where she was standing. "I can see your boot," he said. She stepped out into the middle of the chamber. He looked at her with the expression of a man revising several things at once. He was perhaps 45, weathered in the particular way of men whose grief had worked on them as steadily as the outdoor work had, both leaving marks, the combination producing something harder and more complicated than either alone. His eyes were pale and careful, the eyes of a man who had learned that what he saw in them was usually accurate. He was holding the canteen toward her. He had expected to find someone in worse condition than she appeared. "You found this," he said. It was not a question. "I found this," she said. He looked at the chamber again, at the map that covered the entire left wall. His jaw worked slightly. He was a man to whom expression did not come easily, and what he was looking at was pressing against the places where expression lived. "I've been to this canyon 100 times in 15 years, he said. "I have never seen this." "You were looking for a person," she said, "not a door." He looked at her steadily. "I saw the tracks at the rim. 2 men rode in with you. 1 came back." "Yes." He held out the canteen. She took it and drank carefully, not urgently, and handed it back. He recapped it without taking any himself. "Who are you?" she said. "Callum Hess. I run cattle on a spread 3 miles south of the canyon road." "You know whose land this is?" His eyes moved to the document envelope visible inside the partially open front of her traveling coat. "The Vale Claim, Parcel 47. Your father filed it." He paused. "Do you know what happened to him?" He was quiet for a moment. That was not hesitation. It was the quiet of a man giving weight its proper acknowledgement before speaking. "Not for certain," he said, "but I know he was out here, and I know he stopped being out here, and I know who benefits from men stopping." Eden looked at the iron door at the far end of the chamber. She looked at the carved map on the wall. She looked at the rail system and the side rooms and the vaulted ceiling, at all of the decades of work embedded in every surface of this place. She picked up her notebook from the canyon floor where she had retrieved it from the spot where Nance's man had dropped it. She turned to a new page. "Then let's figure out the certain part," she said. She sat down on a wooden crate near the rail entrance and began to write. Callum Hess stood in the entrance of the fortress that should not have existed in the canyon that everyone believed was empty and fatal, and watched a 22-year-old woman who had just survived being shoved off a cliff begin systematically documenting what she had found. He had been coming to this canyon for 15 years. He had never known this was here. He thought about Margaret, about the way she had looked at things she wanted to understand. That same quality of complete attention the world reduced to the thing directly in front of her and the question it contained. He had not thought about her that way in some time. Usually when he thought about her, it was the last weeks. The fever, the way the days at the end had been arranged, each one a little less of her than the previous one. He stoppered the canteen, sat down on the other crate, and waited for the woman to tell him what she needed. Outside the canyon, the Arizona afternoon was reaching its peak. Heat, the sun having climbed to its highest angle and pressing the shadow out of everything it could reach, the red rock walls absorbing heat and giving it back to the air in steady, invisible waves. Inside the fortress, in the jaw of the earth, in the cool and the dark, and the silence of a place that had held its secret longer than most of the people in the territory above had been alive, Eden Vale wrote down everything she could see. She wrote for 40 minutes. She was not done looking. She had not even started yet. Callum Hess's cabin sat on a flat bench of land where the ridge broke and the country opened to the south. 3 rooms, a stone fireplace that occupied most of the north wall, built with the care of a man who had understood that in this country, a winter fire was not a comfort, but a requirement. A porch facing the valley where the light came in long and level in the mornings and late afternoons, angled and golden. The cabin was clean in the way that a place was clean when one person lived in it and that person had decided that order was the thing within their control. Not tidiness for its own sake. Something more deliberate than that. Eden noticed it on the first morning. The way every object occupied a specific place, and the place had been chosen for a specific reason. The coffee cup on the left side of the shelf where it caught the morning light coming through the east window. The rifle on its pegs at a height precisely calibrated for a man of Callum's reach. The firewood stacked with the split faces outward so they dried fastest. These were not the habits of a man who liked things neat. These were the habits of a man who had decided exactly what he could hold on to and was holding on to it with both hands. She asked him about the photograph on the second day. Not about the order, about the photograph on the shelf above the fireplace. A woman, perhaps 35, standing in front of a fence line with her hand raised against the sun to shield her eyes. Not a posed photograph. Someone had caught her in a moment. Callum was at the table with his morning coffee. He looked at the photograph the way a person looked at something they had looked at 10,000 times and still hadn't come to the end of. "Margaret," he said, "when did she die?" 4 years ago this November. He was quiet for a moment. Fever. The kind that comes fast and sits deep in the chest and turns to something worse before you understand what it's becoming. Eden looked at the photograph. She looks like she's trying to see something on the horizon. She usually was. He drank his coffee, set the cup back in its precise place on the left side of the shelf. The doctor in Harrow saw her twice, said it was manageable. Keep her warm, give it time, let the fever run its course. He looked at the table at the grain of the wood. She was gone in 6 days. The doctor came back at the end and said he was sorry. He had no explanation for why it had moved so fast. Dr. Farr, Aldous Farr, yes. He said the name the way you said the name of a place where something bad had happened to you. Not with heat, with a flatness that was worse than heat. He's been Nance's man since before Nance owned the valley. I didn't know that when it happened. I know it now. He paused. Knowing it now doesn't do a thing for anyone. Eden sat with what he had said and let it occupy the space it deserved. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say she understood. She had found in her experience that people who had lost someone important did not need to be met with the formulaic responses that other people offered, because the formulaic responses were not about the person who had lost someone. They were about the person offering them, trying to resolve their own discomfort at being in the presence of grief they couldn't fix. What the grieving person usually needed was for someone to be present without trying to fix anything. She was present. Callum noticed this. She could tell by the way his shoulders settled. Your father, he said after a time. He came out here following something he believed was real, she said. He was right that it was real, and he died because it was real. She looked at the photograph of Margaret, one hand raised against the sun, always trying to see to the horizon. I don't know the exact circumstances yet, but the circumstances are in that canyon, in the locked room. Among other places, she said. They sat with the fire for a while after that. Callum added a log and they both watched the fire take it. On the third day, she moved around the cabin without holding her ribs. The cracks were bruising outward as they healed the pain, shifting from the sharp, specific kind to the dull, omnipresent kind that she could work around. She ate what Callum made, which was plain and sufficient, in the way that cooking was plain and sufficient when it had been done for one person for a long time without reason to make it anything else. She read through her notebook entries from the fortress and added to them from memory, filling in the details she hadn't had time to record before Callum arrived. She had a systematic approach to this kind of reconstruction. She went room by room in her mind, standing in each space, again turning slowly, recovering each detail in the order she had noticed it. The carved map occupied most of her thinking. The marks on it were not decorative. The lines connecting the marked points followed logical routes, the routes that a person who knew the territory well would actually use to move between the indicated locations. The numbers beside the marks were not coordinates in any surveying system she recognized. They were some other kind of notation, dates and amounts, most likely the standard notation of someone keeping a record of movement, of what went from one place to another and when. She had seen accounting like this before. Her father had kept similar records of ore movements, what came out of a shaft, and where it went, and when it went. The marks on the fortress wall were the same system applied to something else entirely. On the fourth morning, she stood up from the table while Callum was still working on his first cup of coffee. "I need to go back," she said. He looked at her ribs. She was standing straight. "I'll get the horses," he said. They rode out before sunrise. Callum's idea. Anyone watching from Harrow could see two riders heading east in the morning light, so they left in the dark and were well into the canyon country before the light was up enough to be visible from the ridge above the basin. She noticed he rode with his rifle across his saddle in front of him. He had not done that on the ride back from the canyon 4 days ago. She said nothing about it. The canyon in the early morning was different from the canyon in the afternoon heat. The light at the floor was blue-gray instead of gold, and the temperature was genuinely cool, the rock having lost all the heat it had stored the previous day and not yet begun collecting the new day's supply. The silence had a different quality, too cleaner, somehow the absence of the heat's pressure, making it feel less oppressive. They went through the passage and into the fortress. Callum lit the lantern he had brought. The warm glow pushed the darkness back from the walls, and the carved map emerged from the shadow in sections, the raised mountain ranges casting their own small shadows under the lantern's angle. He stopped in front of the map, stood there. "I've been in this territory my whole life," he said after a long moment. "I have never seen a survey of it this complete." "It wasn't made from official records," Eden said. She moved to the map and indicated two marked points north of Devil's Jaw. "These passes aren't on any county survey I've seen. They're too small, too high, too difficult to matter to anyone who isn't specifically looking for a way through that section of ridge. But they're marked here with specific notations." "The gang's knowledge," Callum said. "People who moved through this country at night, who needed to know where every exit was before they needed it." "Exactly." She turned to the side rooms. "The documents need to come first." The strongbox was in the second side room. Iron-banded, substantial, with a lock that had rusted sufficiently over the years that Callum broke it with two blows of the crowbar from his saddlebag. Inside, a tin box sealed with wax, the wax yellowed and cracked with age, but still holding the seal intact. Beneath the tin box, two ledger books in oiled leather covers that had protected them from the conditions of the cave. Eden took the ledgers. She sat on the stone floor of the main chamber with Callum on one side and the lantern between them and opened the first ledger. The handwriting was small and practiced. Each entry dated. Each entry composed of a name, an amount, and a notation that gave the nature of the transaction. She read the first page, the second. She turned to the middle of the book, then to the end, then back to the beginning, establishing the scope of it before reading it in detail. These are the Red Rock Gang's operational records, she said. Complete records, every job, every amount taken, the names of the fences they used and the cut each fence received, the routes they used to approach and depart from each job. Callum leaned over. His finger moved along a line in the middle of the book. I know that date, he said, August of '81, the Haynes payroll robbery. They hit the payroll wagon for the silver mine east of Prescott. 11 men, $40,000. The territory sent 3 separate posses and found nothing. They came back here, Eden said. She showed him the route notation in the ledger. This sequence marks the return route. They came back to the fortress and documented the job and waited. She kept reading. The ledger covered 4 years of operations, 47 recorded incidents. The amounts were staggering. The organization was meticulous. And running through every page entered in a second hand slightly different from the operational entries was a record of disbursements. Not disbursements to the gang, to names in Harrow. She read them aloud. Orton Dane, sheriff, received payments on 9 recorded dates for information regarding posse assembly and deployment. Aldous Farr, physician, received payments on 6 recorded dates for medical services provided to gang members requiring treatment without official record. 3 members of the Harrow Town Council by name, each receiving regular payments described in the ledger as civic cooperation. And at the bottom of each disbursement page in the second hand, a single consistent line, distribution coordinated through S. Nance. Eden read this line on the first disbursement page and went still. She read it on the second, on the 5th, on the 11th, every disbursement page, every year. 4 years of operational records with Nance's name at the bottom of every payment distributed to the people of Harrow. Callum had gone very quiet beside her. He wasn't their fence, Callum said. His voice was flat with the flatness of a man whose long-held suspicions had just been confirmed at a scale he had not fully accounted for. He was their banker, their connection to every official in the county. He was more than that, Eden said. She closed the first ledger. She opened the tin box. Inside the tin box, wrapped in oilcloth that had sealed out the moisture for over a decade, were letters. A thick bundle tied with twine that had gone stiff and dry. And beneath the letters, a second ledger, smaller in different handwriting from the operational ledgers. A personal account. She untied the bundle. The letters were from Rafe Cobb, the leader of the Red Rock Gang. She knew this because the first letter was headed in the same hand as the small ledger. I, Rafe Cobb, being of sound mind and in possession of complete knowledge of the events I'm about to describe, set down the following account for the use of whoever finds it. She read it. Then she read it again without speaking. Then she set it on the stone floor between her and Callum. She let him read it. He read slowly, not because he was a slow reader, because the content required it, because some things needed to be given the time they required. Rafe Cobb had not been what the territory of Arizona had believed him to be. He had been a careful man, a planner, A man who operated at a scale of organization that most people in his position never reached, because most people in his position thought about the next job and not the 10 jobs after it. He had founded the Red Rock Gang not from desperation or impulsiveness, but from a cold assessment of the territory's economic structure and the opportunities it presented to men willing to operate outside its rules. He had selected his men for competence and loyalty and the specific capacity to follow a plan precisely under pressure. And he had built this fortress, not by himself, with financing. The financing had come from Stafford Nance. Cobb's letter laid this out with the precision of a man who had gone over it many times in his mind and was writing it down for the last time with an accuracy he was determined to get exactly right. Nance had come to him in 1874. Nance had been at that time a land speculator with ambitions that exceeded his available capital by a significant margin. He had a vision for the Harrow Valley, a specific and detailed vision of what it could become and what that becoming would be worth to the right person. He had the intelligence to understand that realizing the vision would require money on a scale and at a speed that legitimate means could not supply. Nance had proposed an arrangement. He would provide the capital and logistical support for Cobb's operation. He would manage the distribution of proceeds through his business connections, which meant that the money from the jobs moved through legitimate appearing channels and emerged on the other side clean. He would provide actionable intelligence on payroll movements, law enforcement deployments, witness locations. In exchange for these services, Nance would receive 40% of all proceeds. And when the operation had run its course, when the valley had been sufficiently capitalized by the wealth the operation generated, Nance had promised Cobb and every man who rode with him full pardons, new identities, a clean start in a new place. Cobb had believed him. He wrote this directly. I believed him. I had genuine reason to believe him. For 7 years, this man kept every commitment he made to us without exception. Every piece of intelligence he provided was accurate. Every distribution he coordinated arrived where it was supposed to arrive in the amount it was supposed to be. His word was good. I believed it. The letter then described the final operation. The government gold shipment in October of 1882, the largest job the gang had ever planned. Nance had designed it himself, providing the route, the timing, the specific number of men required at each position, the split afterward, and the escape plan for once the job was done. And the pardons. Signed documents with federal seals delivered to Cobb 2 days before the job as promised. The job had gone perfectly. 3 days later, instead of the guide, Nance had promised to lead the gang out of the territory. Under their new identities, a posse had arrived at the rendezvous point, led by Stafford Nance. Cobb had not been at the rendezvous. He had sent 2 men ahead to verify the guide's presence before committing the full group. The 2 men had not returned. Cobb had waited 3 hours in a secondary position. He had never told Nance about a position he had established years earlier as insurance against exactly this kind of outcome. From the secondary position, he had watched the posse arrive, had watched the ambush, had watched his men die in a narrow cut in the rock with no room to maneuver and no warning nowhere to go. He had watched Nance ride at the front of the posse. He had watched Nance accept the territory marshal's citation for exceptional valor in breaking the most dangerous outlaw gang in Arizona. He had watched the bodies of his men buried in unmarked ground, and then he had come back to the fortress. He had brought the duplicate ledger and his personal correspondence and the gold from the government shipment that he had not trusted Nance with a portion he had held back from the official split, the insurance every careful man kept. He had put it all in the tin box. He had put the people he had been able to bring with him into the last room, and he had locked the door. And then he had written this letter. I do not know how much time I have remaining. Nance knows this place exists. I was careful about it, but not careful enough. He will eventually come looking for the ledgers. He knows they exist, and he knows they would destroy him. I am leaving this for whoever finds it. If you are Nance or one of his men, I cannot prevent you from taking what is here. But I am leaving this letter because I want what happened to be known. Not because I deserve justice, I do not. But the men who died in that cut did not deserve what was done to them. The pardons Nance gave us were forgeries. I had them examined by a lawyer in Flagstaff, a man named Purcell, who confirmed within 2 hours that every federal seal on every document was false. The papers were never real. Nance never had any intention of honoring them. From the first day of the arrangement, the plan was to use us for 10 years and then claim our work as his own achievement and bury us where no one would look. That is what happened. Eden had stopped reading aloud partway through the letter. She had continued reading silently to the end. Now she sat with the letter in her lap and looked at the iron door at the far end of the chamber. The pardons were forgeries from the beginning, Callum said. He built a 10-year operation with men he intended to kill. Yes, she said. The only variable was timing. He needed them long enough to capitalize the valley. Once the operation was complete and the money was deployed, they had served their purpose. Callum looked at the iron door. Open it, he said. Eden got up. She had brought tools. She had known they would need them. A breaking bar and a cold chisel from Callum's saddlebag. The lock on the iron door was old and heavy and designed for permanence, but the mechanism had been exposed to the conditions of the fortress for over a decade, and the metal had worked against itself. It took 20 minutes of steady, methodical work with the chisel before the mechanism gave, and the door swung inward on hinges that made no sound at all, the rust having worked its way into the spaces where sound was made. The smell came out. Eden held the lantern up. The room behind the iron door was smaller than the main chamber, perhaps 12 feet square, low ceiling, the same work stone as the rest of the fortress. The lantern light reached the walls and came back. On the floor, arranged with a terrible and final orderliness, were the remains of 6 people. The sealed conditions of the room had preserved them past the point of ordinary decomposition. Bone and leather and the remains of clothing, each figure in the same position, seated against the wall with their hands at their sides. 6 people, 6 separate lives that had ended in this sealed room in the dark, not bound. Eden looked carefully at the hands of the nearest figure. The hands held something, a folded piece of paper held for over a decade by the dry stillness of the sealed room, preserved by the same conditions that had preserved everything else. She bent down. She took the paper gently from the hands that had held it. She stood back and opened it by the lantern light. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. The document was familiar to her in its format, its structure, its specific combination of printed form and handwritten content. She had a copy of it in the document envelope against her ribs. She was looking at the original of her father's land claim. Parcel 47, Section 9, up against the east ridge of Devil's Jaw Canyon. The name Thomas Vale on the signature line, in her father's specific handwriting, the particular slant of his letters that she had been reading her whole life. The notary stamp from Flagstaff. The county recorder's mark. This was not a copy. This was the original document her father had held and signed, and submitted the document of which she carried a certified copy in her coat. Her father had been here. He had found this room, had found the door, had found the remains, had found this document held in the hands of one of the dead, had understood what it meant. and had been found in turn. Eden did not move for a long time. The lantern light moved slightly in the faint air current from the passage behind her, and the shadows in the room shifted and resettled. Callum had come to stand beside her. He had read the document over her shoulder. He stood very still. She folded the document carefully along the creases her father had put into it. She put it in the document envelope with the copy she had carried from Flagstaff. She buttoned the coat. She looked at the 6 figures on the floor of the sealed room. She looked at them for a full minute. Then she turned away. We need the ledgers, the letters, everything from the tin box, the personal ledger as well. We take it to Prescott, Callum said. We take it to Prescott. She moved to the door. First, I need to copy the map, the route notations. Sayers is going to need all of it. She went back to the main chamber, opened her notebook, and stood in front of the carved map on the left wall. She was on her third page of notes when the sound came. Boots in the passage. One person moving with the careful, deliberate pace of someone familiar with the terrain. She did not move to shadow this time. She stood where she was with her notebook open and waited. Rudd Deeds came through the entrance arch and stopped. He looked at the tin box open on the floor. The ledgers, the letters spread on the stone, the lantern. Callum standing near the iron door with his hand near his rifle. His face showed neither surprise nor alarm. It showed the expression of a man arriving at a destination he had been traveling toward for a long time, and finding that it looked precisely as he had imagined it. You should have left when Nance told you to, he said. His voice was quiet, not threatening, something closer to tired. Eden looked at him. She had been thinking about this man for 4 days. She had turned the note under the hotel door over in her mind, the way she turned difficult problems, looking for the logic of it from every angle. The note had not been written by a man with clean hands who happened to disagree with what was being done to her. The note had been written by a man who knew specifically what was going to happen and was trying to prevent it without being able to explain why he knew. That was not the behavior of a loyal employee. That was the behavior of a man managing a situation of extraordinary complexity. You sent me the note, she said. He looked at her for a moment, then at the ledgers on the floor. I sent you the note. Why? He did not answer immediately. Outside the fortress, the sound that had been building at the edges of awareness resolved. Not the sound she had been tracking, which was Deeds in the passage. A different sound, lower from further away, the particular resonance of thunder over canyon country. The sky outside had been clear and hot when they arrived. The Arizona monsoon season did not give you warnings. Clear and hot until it wasn't the sky going from nothing to storm in the time it took to decide what to do about it. The sound deepened. Then the rain hit. Not gradually, all at once. The way Arizona rain arrived completely and without transition, the sky going from clear to flooding in what felt like seconds. The sound in the passage changed immediately, the tap and run of water beginning to move through the rock channels around the entrance. The sound multiplying as more water found more channels and the channels filled. Flash flood, Callum said. The word was flat and certain. He had lived near this canyon for 15 years, and he knew what this sound meant for the canyon floor. We're not going anywhere for a while, Eden said. She looked at Rudd Deeds. Sit down. He looked at her. She held his gaze. He sat down on a wooden crate near the passage entrance. Outside, the water in Devil's Jaw was rising. They could hear it, the low, sustained roar of a flash flood building in a confined space, the sound filling the air and coming from every direction at once because the walls were everywhere. The fortress entrance was above the flood line. Rafe Cobb had known this canyon well enough to account for it when he built. Eden set her notebook on the floor. She picked up Cobb's letter from the stack of documents and held it out to Rudd Deeds. He looked at it, then at her. He took it. He read, his right hand resting on his knee when he began closed slowly into a fist as he worked down through the pages. When he finished, he did not hand it back. He held it. He looked at the iron door at the far end of the chamber. "Is the door open?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at the door for a long moment. Something in his face that she could not precisely name. Not grief exactly, and not anger exactly, something that encompassed both, and was more fundamental than either. He set the letter down on the crate beside him. He pushed his left sleeve up his forearm. On the inside, old ink gone blue-green with time, and the particular fading that happened to tattoo work after many years was an eagle's head in profile. Sharp, detailed. Below it, a capital R in a specific script. She had seen the same eagle above the entrance arch. "You were Red Rock," Callum said. "The youngest," Rudd Deed said. 22 years old the year Nance came to Cobb with the arrangement. "I'd been riding with the gang for 1 year. He looked at the letter on the crate beside him. "Cobb sent me to Tucson. We had a man with a broken leg, the kind of break that sets wrong if it's not properly handled, and the nearest doctor who would treat us without asking questions was there. 4 days round trip. When I came back..." He stopped. He looked at the iron door. "When I came back, the secondary camp was cold, and the horses were gone, and the main camp was stripped. I rode to the rendezvous and found 6 mounds of fresh dirt with no markers." He paused. "And on the main road back toward Harrow Nance, riding with a federal escort and a citation for valor." "Why didn't you run?" Eden said. "I was 22 years old with a gang tattoo on my forearm and my name connected to 47 documented robberies and no money and no papers that didn't identify me as a wanted man." He looked at his hands. "I went to Nance. I told him I'd been in Tucson. I told him I knew what had happened and I had no intention of making trouble about it. And he let you live." "He let me live. He gave me work. He kept me where he could see me." Rudd looked at the floor. A man he could trust to be quiet because a man who testifies against the person he's testifying about goes to the gallows alongside him. He understood that. He used it. 10 years, Eden said. 10 years. The flood outside was at its peak. The roar was total, filling the passage and vibrating in the work stone of the fortress walls, the sound coming through the rock as much as through the air. They were sealed in completely and completely safe. Cobb had understood the canyon's hydrology when he chose this site. Eden opened the personal ledger. "You know the accounts in this." "I know every account." "Sheriff Dane. Dane has been on Nance's direct payroll since before the Red Rock arrangement. He doesn't know where the original money came from. He knows he gets paid for information, and he doesn't ask about the source." "Dr. Farr." Rudd Deeds looked at Callum. Callum looked back at him with the expression of a man who had been asking himself a question for 4 years and was about to receive the answer, not with relief, because the answer was not going to be a good one, but with the particular resolution of a man who has decided that knowing is better than not knowing, regardless of what the knowing costs. Farr received payments from Nance for medical services to gang members over 7 years, Rudd said. He looked at Callum directly, and for other services afterward. Advice on patient outcomes. Advice on what conditions would respond to treatment and what conditions would not given the right management of the treatment. He stopped. He looked at the crate. "I'm sorry about your wife. I knew about it after the fact. I didn't know in time to..." He stopped again. Callum said nothing. The silence stretched. Eden turned a page in the ledger. "The note you sent me," she said, "under the hotel door." Rudd Deeds looked at her. "Your father came out here," he said. "I found his tracks at the canyon entrance and tracked him into the canyon and found evidence that he had found the passage. By the time I understood the full sequence of what had happened, it was already done. Nance's men had followed him in." He paused. "I sent you the note because I couldn't give you a second chance to repeat what your father did." Eden looked at him steadily for a long moment. She had been thinking about what kind of man this was, what was underneath the 10 years of managed silence and careful survival. What remained of the person who had existed before the situation he was in had shaped him into what she had been observing for 4 days. She had turned this over methodically the way she turned all difficult problems. What she saw was a man who had made the most frightening choice a person could make, which was to stop managing and let the situation resolve into whatever it was actually going to be. "Cobb writes about a piece of land," she said. "In that letter, a life he wanted after, a water source, high ground." Rudd looked at the letter on the crate beside him. "He talked about it," he said. "In the evening sometimes when we were waiting. He was tired. He'd been doing this for 10 years and he wanted to be done with it. He thought Nance was the way out." He paused. He didn't understand that Nance was the end of the road. Eden reached into her coat. She took out the document envelope. She opened it and removed the original land claim from the sealed room, the one with her father's signature and the dark mark in the corner. She set it on the stone floor next to Cobb's letter. Rudd looked at both of them, the letter, the claim, side by side on the floor of the fortress. He read the description in the letter. He looked at the location notation on the claim, at the parcel number, at the section designation. "Same land," he said. "Same land," Eden said. "A man who spent 10 years taking from people and wanted to stop, and a man who spent 20 years looking for the right piece of ground. They never met each other. They never spoke. And they both looked at the same piece of worthless ridge country and saw something worth building a life on." She folded the claim and put it back in the envelope. Nance killed both of them to make sure neither of them got there. The flood outside had begun to ease, the roar dropping in register, the water finding its level and receding, the air through the passage freshening as the rain stopped and the canyon breathed again. The three of them sat in the lantern light of the fortress in the silence after what had been said. Rudd Deeds looked at the passage entrance, at Callum, at Eden. "I can testify to everything in those ledgers," he said. "Every name, every date, every amount. I can place each entry in the context of a specific event and confirm the connection." He paused. "I can connect Nance directly to the ambush in '82. I wasn't there, but I was told about it afterward in enough detail to testify to his specific instructions and his specific role." "You understand what happens to you," Eden said. "I understand. And you're willing." He looked at Cobb's letter on the floor beside him. He looked at it for a long time. "I've been carrying this for 10 years, he said. "I want to set it down." Eden picked up her notebook. "Then tell me everything from the beginning," she said. "While the water drops. Tell me every name and every amount and every connection you know. Everything." Rudd Deeds looked at the notebook. He began to talk. Outside, the floodwater receded through the floor of Devil's Jaw, carrying the red desert sand and the debris of the storm out through the canyon mouth and into the open country beyond. The fortress that Rafe Cobb had built and Stafford Nance had used and Edenvale had found stood in the washed and quiet aftermath of the storm and held everything that had been entrusted to it for over a decade. Inside, three people filled a notebook with a decade of truth. When the passage was clear, they gathered the ledgers and the letters and all the documents from the tin box into the saddlebags. They walked out through the carved arch and into the clean-washed air of the Arizona evening, the desert smelling of wet rock and sage, and the particular freshness of air after a monsoon, and they pointed their horses west away from Harrow toward Prescott. Eden did not look back. She had what she came for. She had what her father had come for and had died finding. She put her heels to her horse and rode. The desert at night was a different country, not quieter. The desert was never quiet. It had its own constant texture of sound, the low omnipresent presence of wind and insect, and small things moving that did not move in daylight. But the quality of the sound was different after dark. More honest, perhaps. Less performed. The absence of the sun changed what the desert was willing to be. They rode through most of the first night. Eden's decision. Nance's people would know the water had dropped by morning and would start looking when the canyon road became passable again. Distance was what they needed before then. Callum had not argued. Rudd Deeds had said nothing. They rode in a line, the saddlebags across the horses' rumps, the stars overhead, the dark shapes of the ridge lines dropping away behind them as the country climbed. By midnight, they were above the Harrow Basin. The lights of the town were a faint, scattered warmth below, and behind them, already remote, already belonging to something she had left. By 2 in the morning, they were in open country, with nothing behind them but dark and distance. They stopped then, an hour because the horses needed it. They ate from the supplies Callum had packed and did not speak much. The desert cold at this altitude was genuine cold, the temperature having dropped 30 degrees since the afternoon, and they sat close to a small fire that Callum built in the lee of a rock outcrop where the light would not carry. Rudd Deeds sat apart from the other two. Not pointed apart, not trying to communicate distance, just the habit of a man who had spent 10 years living at the edge of other people's circles, never fully inside, never far enough outside to be free. Eden watched him. She had been watching him since they left the fortress, trying to take an accurate account of what he actually was, separate from what 10 years under Nance's management had made him look like. What was underneath the careful survival? What had kept itself intact through a decade of that particular kind of compromise? What she saw was a man doing the most frightening thing available to a person, which was to stop managing and let the situation go where it was going to go. "When we get to Prescott," she said quietly enough that it was only for him. Rudd looked at her. "Tell Sayers everything from your own memory before he looks at the ledgers," she said. "Not because the ledgers need support. They don't. But when a man testifies to what he lived, it sounds different from when he reads from a document. I want Sayers to hear that difference." Rudd looked at the fire. "You know federal marshals," he said. "I know the difference between evidence and testimony," she said. "My father used to say that in a mining dispute, the documents tell you what happened and the witness tells you why it mattered. You need both." Rudd nodded. He said nothing else. Callum handed a canteen to Eden and one to Rudd without making a gesture of it. He was a man who expressed things through provision rather than words. She had been learning this about him. The coffee placed where the morning light caught it, the precisely stacked firewood, the canteen offered before she thought to want it. She lay down on the ground with her coat over her and was asleep in 4 minutes. The second day was hard travel. The country between Harrow and Prescott was broken in the particular way of country that was neither wilderness nor settled too rough for easy farming, too far from water for easy ranching. The land that had been passed over by the first wave of settlement and had not yet been claimed by the second. They stayed off the main road when they could, using the secondary tracks that Callum knew from years of moving cattle through the high country. Longer, but considerably less visible. Nobody followed them, or if someone did, they were too far back to matter. On the second night, they camped near a creek that ran clean off the plateau. Rudd Deeds asked to look at the ledgers. Eden considered this for a moment, then she handed them to him. He sat with them by the firelight for 2 hours, going through each page carefully, sometimes stopping to look at the darkness beyond the fire, sometimes moving his lips slightly in the way of someone cross-referencing what they were reading against what they remembered. When he gave them back, he also gave her 3 handwritten pages torn from her notebook that she had lent him. Dates, names, additional details that were not in the ledgers but that corroborated them from the inside the way only a witness who had been present could corroborate them. She read through his additions. The Flagstaff payroll job in October of '82, she said. You have 2 names here that Cobb's ledger doesn't include. Cobb didn't know them, Rudd said. They were Nance's men, not gang men. He brought them in specifically for the final job to manage the outer perimeter. They had no idea what they were involved with or who they were actually working for. Where are they now? One died of fever 2 years later. The other is running cattle in the New Mexico territory. Name and location are in the notes. Eden wrote the information separately. The forged pardons, she said. Cobb's letter says he had them examined by a lawyer in Flagstaff named Purcell. Purcell verified them and moved to San Francisco within 2 months, Rudd said. I don't know whether Nance arranged the move or whether Purcell simply decided on his own that he didn't want to be in the territory anymore. Marshal Sayers will find him. Rudd looked at the fire. If he's findable, Sayers will find him, she said, not as reassurance, as a factual observation about the kind of man who became a federal marshal with an unbroken reputation for integrity over 20 years of service. The finding kind. On the 3rd morning, they came over the ridge above Prescott and looked down at it in the early light. Prescott was larger than Harrow by a factor of 10 and had the look of a place that had decided to be permanent and was proceeding on that basis. Wide streets, substantial stone buildings, the civic architecture of a territorial capital that intended to be a state capital eventually and was building accordingly. They rode down into the town before the business day had fully started. The streets were quiet with the particular quiet of a city morning. The few people moving having the purposeful, unhurried look of people who knew exactly where they were going and had been going there for years. The federal marshal's office was a 2-story stone building on the north side of the main plaza. The flag above it moved steadily in the morning wind. Eden tied her horse at the rail. She checked the document envelope inside her coat. She checked the saddlebag with the ledgers. She went in. Federal Marshal Leland Sayers was a tall man in his late 50s, with the erect posture of someone who had spent formative years in the military and had not lost the habit and the particular deliberate, unhurried manner of someone who had learned over a long career that urgency was usually the enemy of accuracy. He had gray hair cut close and a close-trimmed gray beard and eyes of a warm brown that appeared neutral to someone looking at them quickly, but were in fact taking in everything in the room at once and filing it with great precision. He looked at Eden when she came in. He looked at Callum behind her. He looked at Rudd Deeds and held for a moment longer than the others. I need to report a series of crimes, Eden said. Some of them going back 12 years. I have documentation, physical evidence, and a willing witness. Sayers looked at her. Sit down, he said. She sat. She talked for 40 minutes without interruption. She laid it out in the order it had happened, starting with her father's original claim and ending with the ride to Prescott. She did not editorialize. She did not express grief or outrage. She stated what had occurred, what each piece of evidence showed, and what the witness could corroborate. It was a precise recitation, and she delivered it with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it, not in the sense of performance, but in the sense of making sure every element was in its correct place. When she finished, Sayers looked at Callum. "You'll corroborate the account of the fortress and its contents." "Everything she described," Callum said. "I was present for the discovery." Sayers looked at Rudd Deeds. Rudd told his story from the beginning in the order Eden had suggested from his own memory, before the ledgers were produced. He named names and dates and amounts and connections with the specificity of a man who had spent 10 years memorizing every detail of his situation because he had understood from the beginning that his survival was information dependent and the information had to be exact. Sayers did not interrupt him. When Rudd finished, Sayers asked 4 questions. Each one targeted a specific potential gap in the account. Each one received an answer that closed the gap. Then he looked at Eden. She placed the ledgers on his desk. The letters from Cobb, her notebook with the map notations, and Rudd's 3 supplementary pages. The original land claim from the sealed room with her father's signature, and the dark mark in the corner where it had rested against bone for over a year. Sayers examined each item with methodical care. He handled the documents the way documents deserve to be handled, which was with attention to their physical condition as well as their content. He called in a clerk. The clerk examined the ledgers, the paper, the binding, the ink. "Consistent with documents from the period Marshall," the clerk said quietly. "Iron gall ink throughout. Significant oxidation consistent with age. This is authentic material." Sayers looked at the original land claim for a long moment. He looked at the dark mark at the corner. He set it down. "I'll need 2 days to prepare the warrants and assemble my deputies," he said. "You'll remain in Prescott until we're ready to move." "Nance may become aware that something is wrong," Eden said. "He may," Sayers said. "A man who knows we're coming and doesn't run is a man who believes he can talk his way out. That's the most useful thing a guilty man can believe because it keeps him in the room while we're collecting him." He paused. "It usually doesn't hurt us." He looked at Rudd Deeds. "You understand what you've done here," he said. "Yes," Rudd said, "and you're prepared for what follows." Rudd looked at the desk, at the ledgers, at Cobb's letter which was sitting at the top of the stack where Eden had placed it. "I've been prepared for a long time," he said. "I was waiting for the right circumstances." He looked at Eden when he said it. She met his look and nodded once. Sayers stood. He shook Eden's hand, then Callum's, then after a brief consideration Rudd's. 2 days, he said. Stay close. The 2 days in Prescott were quiet in the way that days were quiet when what you were waiting for was significant and the waiting was the only thing to do. Eden spent one afternoon at the county surveyor's office with the government survey records confirming the precise boundaries of Parcel 47 with the surveyor himself, a meticulous man in his 50s who had been keeping these records for 15 years and took a quiet professional pleasure in the accuracy of them. She had him mark the permanent water source on the parcel map with its specific designation and confirm the government assessment of it. The parcel sat on a bench of high ground at the east rim of Devil's Jaw Canyon. The spring that fed it came out of the rock face at the base of a low cliff and had been assessed as permanent and year-round in the original government survey. One of 3 such sources in the entire section of ridge country. Her father had known. He had spent 20 years following what the rock told him, and he had found the one place in that section that the rock said was worth stopping at. He had put his name on it and tried to understand what else was nearby and had been killed for finding it. She walked back to the hotel through the Prescott afternoon through the streets of a city that did not know it was about to be asked to reckon with what had been done in its neighboring valley. She thought about Rafe Cobb writing his letter in a darkness that was the same darkness she had stood in, describing the same piece of ground from the angle of a man who had never stood on it and never would. Two men who had never met both of them, gone both of them right. She kept her hands in her pockets and walked. On the second day in the afternoon, Callum found her in the hotel's small sitting room and sat in the chair across from her. He was quiet for a while. The quality of his silence had changed since the first days at his cabin. It was the same silence, contained and deliberate, but the thing it contained had shifted. "When this is done," he said, "what do you do? Build something on the parcel." "Alone." She looked at him. "I've been doing things alone since I was 17. "I know." He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who had been building and maintaining things on his own for 4 years. "I know good stone for a foundation in this country. I know the freight routes from here to the ridge, and I know the canyon country well enough to navigate it in the dark." She looked at him. He looked back. "Come by in the morning," she said. "After this is done, we can walk the site." He nodded. On the morning of the third day, Marshal Sayers and 6 deputies rode out of Prescott toward Harrow. Eden and Callum rode with them. Rudd Deeds rode slightly apart as he had ridden since Devil's Jaw, not quite inside the group and not quite outside it, occupying the particular position of a man who had not yet fully determined where he belonged. The ride to Harrow took most of the day. They came into the valley from the west, cresting the ridge with the afternoon sun behind them. The arrival of 7 federal officers with a civilian group was visible from the upper road long before they reached the valley floor. Sayers did not try to prevent this. "A man who knows we're coming and doesn't run," he had said that morning, "is a man who believes he can talk his way out." He had looked at his deputies with the expression of a man who had seen this particular dynamic play out many times. Let him believe it. Harrow absorbed their arrival the way a small town absorbed any significant event, which was all at once and collectively. People drifted to doorways. The man outside the hardware store who had been loading a wagon stopped loading and stood with a crate in his hands. The woman on the hotel porch set down the thing she was doing. At the far end of the main street near the saloon, a small group gathered with the specific watchfulness of people who understood that something consequential was occurring and had not yet decided how they felt about it. Sayers rode directly to the land office. Arthur, the land office man, opened his door at the sound of the horses and saw the federal badges. He closed the door. He opened it again when Sayers knocked. He answered questions for 30 minutes in a voice that had entirely lost its studied vagueness, the quality of careful delay that Eden had encountered on her first visit and had become extremely precise and cooperative in a very short time. He produced a file. The file contained correspondence between Arthur and Stafford Nance regarding Parcel 47. The correspondence showed that Nance had been informed of Eden's arrival within 1 hour of her visit to the land office, had directed Arthur to delay the processing by whatever means available, and had provided specific instruction about how to manage her inquiry and deter her persistence. It was not the most serious document in the case, but it was a clean, documented, direct line from Nance to the first obstruction Eden had encountered in Harrow. Sayers added it to the file. He dispatched 2 deputies to the sheriff's office and 2 to the doctor's office with warrants prepared in Prescott. He took 1 deputy with him to Nance's business premises. He asked Callum and Eden to wait. Eden waited in the street. Callum waited on the boardwalk. She watched the town absorb what was happening. The 2 deputies who went to the sheriff's office had their business done in 4 minutes. Orton Dane came out the front door in the manner of a man who had been explaining something very earnestly and was continuing to explain it as he was walked toward the federal holding wagon. He was talking with the particular energy of a man who believed that the right combination of words would change the situation. The situation did not change. Dr. Farr came out of his surgery quietly. No explanation, no argument. He walked between the two deputies with his eyes on the ground and his hands at his sides. He looked like what he was, which was a man who had known this was coming for a long time and had simply been waiting for the specific morning it arrived. Callum stepped off the boardwalk when he saw the doctor. Eden watched him cross the street. He stopped in front of Farr. The deputies looked at their instructions. The instructions covered interference with the arrest, but not the presence of a third party. They stepped back 2 feet. Callum looked at Farr for a long moment without speaking. Farr did not look up immediately. When he did, his face was the face of a man who had run out of everything he had been using to avoid what was directly in front of him. Callum reached into his coat pocket. He took out a piece of paper and set it on the flat surface of the water trough beside them. He did not explain what it was. It was a copy he had made of the ledger entry with Farr's name, the date, the notation for payment received, the week in which it fell, the week in which Margaret Hess had died. Farr looked at it. He did not speak. Callum watched him look at it for a long moment. Then Callum stepped back and let the deputies take Farr toward the holding wagon. He came back across the street and stood beside Eden. Neither of them spoke. They stood side by side in the Harrow afternoon and watched. Then Sayers came out of Nance's business premises, with Nance walking ahead of him, one deputy on each side, a third behind. Nance came out walking, not being walked. His coat was buttoned. His hat was on straight. He was talking, his voice low, and measured the smile present at reduced intensity, adjusted for circumstances. He was still managing the situation, still looking for the room that could be talked through. He had been looking for that room his whole life and had found it every time until now. He came out into the street and he saw the holding wagon and the federal deputies and the people watching from every doorway and boardwalk along the length of the main street. And then he saw Eden. She was standing in the middle of the street with Callum beside her, and Rudd Deeds 2 steps behind and to her left where he had stood since they left the fortress. Nance's pace slowed, not stopped. He was too disciplined for that, but slowed. His eyes moved from Eden to Rudd, and the expression on his face moved through a rapid series of calculations. Rudd, standing openly behind Eden, meeting his gaze without flinching, was the piece that completed the picture. Whatever Nance had believed about what they had, whatever he had told himself about what could be proved, Rudd Deeds standing there settled the question. Eden reached into her coat. She took out the original land claim, the one with her father's signature, and the dark mark at the corner. She did not speak. She held it up where Nance could see it, where the street could see it. The people in the doorways and on the boardwalks could not read the text of the document from that distance. They did not need to. They could read the situation. They could read what it meant that the young woman who had arrived on the stage a week ago and been laughed at in the saloon was standing in the middle of the main street holding a piece of paper while Stafford Nance was being escorted to a federal holding wagon. The street understood this. Nance looked at the document. He looked at Eden, and the smile was gone. Not diminished, extinguished, like a lamp whose oil had run out. The face underneath it was older than she had thought, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, and there was nothing in it now except the precise expression of a man who had reached the end of something he had been running from for a long time. She held the document steady until the deputies walked him past her. He did not look at her again. The holding wagon moved down the main street of Harrow with Nance and Dane and Farr and two additional men from Nance's operation who had been collected from his premises. Sayers rode alongside. The deputies formed a loose perimeter. The people in the doorways watched it go. The woman from the hotel porch had come down to the street. The hardware store man had set his crate down. The group at the saloon end had grown and was watching in the way of people processing something that was going to require them to revise a great deal of what they had believed about their own town. Sayers stopped beside Eden before he rode out. "The federal inquiry will need your testimony in Prescott," he said, "within the month." "I'll be there," she said. He looked at Rudd Deeds. "Arrange transportation to Prescott tomorrow morning," he said. "My office will have the full terms of the arrangement for you." Rudd nodded. Sayers looked at Eden one final time with a quality of recognition that had nothing to do with warmth, the look of a man who had cataloged something unusual in a way that would remain in the catalog. Then he rode. The holding wagon rolled out of Harrow and the sound of it faded, and the main street was left with its own silence. Eden put the land claim back in her coat. During the 2 days in Prescott, while Sayers had been preparing his warrants, Eden had requested access to the documents seized from Nance's business premises in an earlier investigation that had been conducted but never fully prosecuted for reasons that were now becoming clear. Sayers had authorized it with a brief note to the records office. She had gone through the seized documents box herself methodically because she was the one who knew what she was looking for, and because the methodical reading of documents was something she had been doing since she was old enough to follow her father to the county records office in whatever town they happened to be in. She had found it in the third box. A private land registry maintained in Nance's own hand, distinct from his official business records. It documented his personal holdings and aspirations as opposed to his transacted business. Each parcel in the territory that he considered significant was entered with a description, a current owner notation, and his own assessment of value and strategy. Parcel 47, Section 9, East Ridge of Devil's Jaw Canyon was entered on a page by itself. The entry was dated 1882. The same year as the ambush. In Nance's handwriting, spring source confirmed. Permanent. Year-round reliability. Best water on the East Ridge. Hold at all costs. Below this, in a slightly different ink added later Vale claim filed. Contact Arthur to monitor. Do not allow transfer. And below that, in the most recent ink, the most recent edition, Vale deceased. Daughter has papers. Urgent. Eden had read this 3 times standing in the records office in Prescott with the box open in front of her. Then she had photographed the page in her notebook, copying it word for word, and put the record back in the box. Nance had not been trying to bury the fortress in the ledgers because he was afraid of being exposed. He had been afraid of that, yes, but he had also been trying to protect the water source. He had known about the spring for 12 years. He had known it was the best permanent water on that section of ridge. He had been holding the parcel, keeping it from being claimed by anyone keeping it available, waiting for the right moment to acquire it properly. He had killed her father not just to protect his secret. He had killed her father because her father was standing between him and the piece of land he had decided he wanted. She had not told Callum this yet. She had held it in the notebook and thought about it during the ride back to Harrow, and was still turning it over when Rudd Deeds came to stand in front of her on the empty main street after the holding wagon had rolled away. "I'll go to Prescott tomorrow," he said. "Sayers will have conditions for me. I expect to be held there through the trial." "I know," she said. He looked at the envelope inside her coat. "Cobb wanted that land," he said. He wrote about it more than once. In the letter, in conversation. He described what he'd do with a spring that reliable. He knew water from years of needing to know where it was. He said a permanent spring on high ground could run a small operation year-round without a dry season problem. He was right, Eden said. The government survey confirms it's one of 3 permanent sources in the section. Rudd looked at the street. He was a complicated man, he said. He did a great deal of harm and he knew it, and he kept doing it anyway, and he also wanted to stop. A pause. I think that's what the letter was for, not just to document Nance. He wanted someone to know he had wanted to stop. Eden looked at him steadily. Someone knows, she said. He nodded. He picked up the reins of his horse. He turned without saying goodbye and rode toward the hotel to arrange his transport in the same quiet, practical way he had been arranging things for 10 years in a situation not of his choosing. She watched him go. She thought about what he was carrying, not just the legal circumstances, the 10 years of watching, of knowing, of managing, the weight of what you knew and couldn't act on and had to accommodate daily. She thought the weight of that was not small and that setting it down, even the way he was being required to set it down, had to be something. She turned and found Callum standing at the edge of the boardwalk with both horses. He looked at her with the expression she had come to understand, which was not the absence of expression, but the presence of something kept carefully in. "Where do you want to go?" he said. She thought about the hotel, the meals she owed her body, the sleep she owed herself. She thought about the land. "East," she said. He held the reins of her horse out to her. She mounted. They rode east out of Harrow in the last light of the day, the red rock ridge rising ahead of them, the smell of the washed desert around them from the previous day's storm, everything clean and clear and sharp-edged in the evening air. They did not go into the canyon. She went to the parcel instead, approaching it from the east by the route she had identified from the government survey. The land sat on a bench of high ground at the canyon's eastern rim, sloping gently toward the east face of the ridge. The scrub here was denser than the flat country below. The soil was different, darker, richer in the way that desert soil was richer near a permanent water source, the moisture working its way into the earth from below and changing its character. She heard the spring before she saw it. It came out of the rock face at the base of a low cliff, a steady emergence of cold, clear water running from a fissure in the stone that had been open long enough for the edges to be worn smooth by the flow. The water collected in a natural basin the rock had formed over years and spilled from the basin into a small channel that ran east down the slope, the channel defined by the darker vegetation that grew along its edges. She got off her horse. She knelt beside the basin, put her hand in. Cold. The actual cold of water that came from deep in the rock where the temperature was constant and the sun had never reached. The cold of the ground's own coolness preserved and delivered to the surface. Her father had put his hand in this water. She did not know how long he had stayed. She did not know exactly what he had thought sitting here on the bench of high ground with the spring running cold beside him and the canyon country falling away to the west and the open territory extending to the east. She thought she knew the general shape of it. She thought he had felt what she felt right now, which was the specific satisfaction of a person who has been looking for a long time and has found the right place. And then he had gone into the canyon to investigate something he had noticed, some detail in the terrain or in the rock that his 20 years of reading this kind of country had told him deserved examination. And he had found the fortress and the door and what was behind the door. And he had been found in turn. She closed her hand around the cold water. Then she opened it and let the water run out between her fingers and watched it fall back into the basin. She stood. She walked the perimeter of the parcel in the last light. The bench of high ground was larger than it appeared from below. perhaps 15 acres of relatively level ground before the slope toward the canyon began. The rocky outcrops that made the lower country difficult to work were largely absent on this bench. The soil along the spring channel had the character of soil that had been receiving organic matter from the spring's margins for a long time. Callum rode the perimeter slowly, not ahead of her, not directing, present without directing. She had noticed that about him. He was present without directing. It was a quality that was rarer than people generally understood. She looked at where the cabin would go. Not large. A solid, single-room structure with a loft for sleeping with the spring positioned above it, so the water ran toward it naturally. A workshop attached on the east side. Stone foundation because she had been taught to build on stone and had no reason to deviate. Enough room to expand later if later required it. She thought about her father pressing the claim papers into her hands. It ain't much, Rosie, but it's ours. It's a start. She had not been called Rosie since she was 10 years old. Only he had called her that. The diminutive had seemed like something he had held on to from the time before her mother died, when she had been small enough for it to fit. She stood at the place where the cabin would go and looked east over the slope of the parcel to the open country beyond the mesas, going dark in the distance against a sky that was turning the specific deep blue that preceded the full dark of a desert night, each layer of color deeper than the last. The day releasing itself into the dark by gradations too slow to watch directly, but clearly visible if you looked away and then back. Callum stopped his horse near her. "Good ground," he said. "It's good ground." He was quiet for a while, the kind of quiet that was occupied. "The spring runs year-round. I've been through this canyon country in January. The water levels I've seen there. It doesn't freeze out and it doesn't drop. I know the county survey confirms it." He looked at the ground, at the sky, at the canyon rim to the west where the last light was still sitting. "Your father spent his life looking for the right piece," he said. "He did. And he found it." He found it. She looked at the spring at the channel running east down the slope in the last light. He just didn't get to keep it. Callum looked at the canyon rim for a long moment. "What are you going to build?" he said. She thought about this. She thought about it with the same methodical quality she brought to everything, the specific, practical consideration of what the ground could support, what the water would allow, what one person with some skills and some resources could accomplish on a timeline that was realistic. "Something worth keeping," she said. He nodded once. The stars were starting. One and then several, and then the sky opening into the full desert display, brilliant and cold, the Milky Way coming up over the east horizon and arching overhead. She stood at the edge of her father's ground and looked at the spring and the bench of land and the canyon rim to the west, with the fortress inside it, sealed behind its carved arch, waiting for the government inquiry that would determine what was done with it. She thought about Rafe Cobb writing his letter in the dark of the fortress, describing this piece of ground with the accuracy of a man who had surveyed it and the longing of a man who had decided it was what he wanted when the long, terrible thing he was doing was finally done. She thought about her father reading The Rock of the Canyon Country with 20 years of accumulated knowledge and arriving at the same conclusion. Two men who had never met, both of them gone now. Both of them right about the same stretch of Arizona earth. And now she was the third. She put her hand into her coat pocket and felt the edge of the document envelope. She took it out. She opened it. She took out the original land claim, the one with her father's signature, the dark mark at the corner where it had rested against bone for over a year in the sealed room. She looked at it in the last of the light, at her father's handwriting, at the specific slant of his letters that she had been reading her whole life, at the notary stamp from Flagstaff, circular and precise. She thought about him pressing this into her hands. Keep them close. She folded the document carefully along the creases he had put into it. Not folded away, folded for keeping, the way you folded something you were going to need to open again. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope inside her coat against her ribs the way he had carried it, the way she had carried it from the moment she understood what it was. It was not a thing to be set down. It was a thing to be carried. Callum rode up and stopped his horse beside her. Tomorrow I'll start on the lumber costs, she said. I'll need to know the freight rate from Prescott. He looked at her, at the land, at the spring, at the canyon rim to the west. I know the freight routes, he said, and I know what stone to use for a foundation in this country, the kind that doesn't heave in the freeze cycle. He paused. If you want someone who knows what they're looking at. She thought about Margaret Hess in the photograph on the shelf of the cabin, one hand raised against the sun, always trying to see to the horizon. She thought about her father pressing the papers into her hands with the quiet confidence of a man making a decision he had been building toward for years. She thought about Rafe Cobb writing his letter in the dark of the fortress, writing it for no one in particular, and for whoever would eventually find it writing it, because he wanted what had happened to be known. She thought about what it was to want a piece of ground enough to write it down, to want a quiet life with a water source and a view of the open country and no more running. Two men who had wanted this ground. She was the third. Come by in the morning, she said. We can walk the foundation line before it gets hot. Callum nodded. He turned his horse south toward his ranch. She watched him ride. She watched him until the dark absorbed him, and there was only the sound of his horse on the rock, and then only the night. She turned back to the land. The full dark had come the way desert dark came completely, and without gradations, the transition from evening to night immediate and total. The stars were brilliant and cold overhead, brilliant in the way that stars over the desert were brilliant when there was no other light for 100 miles in any direction to dilute them. The spring moved in its channel with a low, patient sound that was the sound of something that had been doing the same thing for a very long time and had no reason to stop. She stood on her father's ground, her ground. She stood there and let the land be what it was, which was solid and real and present under her feet, the spring running cold beside her in the dark, the fortress sealed behind its carved arch in the canyon to the west. There were things that needed to be done. The testimony in Prescott within the month, the foundation assessment before the ground froze, the lumber order, the freight arrangement, the 1,000 practical necessities of building something in a place where nothing had been built. There was work enough. She stood there until she was ready. Then she mounted her horse and rode back toward Harrow in the dark, and the land settled into its nighttime self behind her, quiet and patient, and entirely indifferent to what had been decided above it, the way land was indifferent to everything except what was done to it with time and effort and the specific intention to stay. The spring ran on. It would run through the winter and through the spring that followed and through the summer after that. It would run when she was building and when she was resting and when she was absent and when she returned. It would run because it had been running since before any person had stood beside it, and would run after. She had put her hand in it. She had let it run out between her fingers. She was still carrying the cold of it in her hand when she rode into the lights of Harrow, and she thought that was as good a way as any to carry a thing forward into what came next. In the morning there was work to do.